Welcome everyone to the Commonwealth Club for another amazing event. My name is Ken Broad. I'm a longtime supporter of the Commonwealth Club, World Affairs here. My wife Jackie, and we're delighted to be sponsoring tonight's program. Before we get started, a few of the usual reminders. Please make sure your phone is silenced. It seems like every time there's one person where it goes off because the program is being recorded. If you have any questions for the speaker, please, there'll be cards coming around. You can write them down, or if you're watching remotely, people in Boston and elsewhere, you can submit them electronically, and those will get to our moderator. For those here in person, we have free copies of the book out back. Afterwards, directly after this event, we will have a wine reception and book signing, so please stick around for that. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Jonathan Turley is a renowned litigator, has served as counsel in some of the most notable cases over the past 2 decades, representing members of Congress, judges, whistleblowers, 5 former attorney generals, accused spies and terrorists, journalists, protesters, and even workers at the secret facility Area 51. Jonathan has testified before Congress over 100 times, including during the impeachments of Presidents Bill Clinton and Donald Trump. For nearly 30 years, Jonathan has held the Shapiro Chair for Public Interest Law at George Washington University Law School. His incredibly detailed new book, Rage in the Republic, The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution, explores the origins of the American democracy and assesses whether it can survive in a rapidly changing world. This book is meticulously researched, well over 6 years of effort, 50 pages of endnotes, lots of really neat pictures. It's a wonderful celebration of our nation's 250th anniversary, and specifically an ode to both Thomas Paine and the indispensable right of free speech. Moderating tonight's program is Greg Dalton, Commonwealth Club World Affairs Vice President. Please join me in welcoming both Jonathan and Greg to this podium and the stage.
Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
It's great to be here with a public intellectual at a public forum.
Thank you very much.
So the first part of the book focuses on Thomas Paine, who you describe as the most influential voice in the American Revolution, which is a novel, not necessarily common interpretation. How about there? There we go. Does it help if I turn the mic on? Does that happen? Yes.
What he said earlier was that this book changed his life. And no, sorry.
Fascinating. Yes, exactly. So the first part of the book centers on Thomas Paine, who you call the most influential voice of the American Revolution, not a common interpretation. So why was Paine's contribution and his story so significant? And why don't we hear more about him than the usual Adams, Jefferson, Madison?
That is a great question, Greg. And first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I must say that I became obsessed with Thomas Paine for 6 years, to the point that I drove my children crazy. He is, without question, the most fascinating historical figure I have ever researched. And your question is a particularly profound one, because Paine is not treated in that way. But also, as I talk about Rage in the Republic, Paine was never popular with many of the founders and the framers. Today, as back then, they preferred someone like Thomas Jefferson, who was handsome and erudite and well-educated, and also, by the way, a slave owner. Thomas Paine was vehemently anti-slavery, but the thing to keep in mind about Paine is, and this is perhaps the most remarkable aspect, is that when Thomas Paine came to this country, an absolute and utter failure. He had failed in everything in his life. He had failed, every business had gone into insolvency. He had been fired from every job he ever held. His marriages were failures. And when he had hit rock bottom, he ended up in front of a man in London penniless, unkempt, without a friend in the world. And this person looked at this pile of human wreckage and saw something. Now, that person was Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin had a knack for spotting talent. But his greatest achievement may have been Thomas Paine, because no one saw anything in Thomas Paine. But Franklin did. And he paid for Paine to come to the United States. Paine almost died on the voyage. He wrote his son, who was governor, to get him a job. And he told Paine, I think you should write. And Paine had to be carried off the ship. He almost died on the voyage. That was 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. 2 years. So within 2 years, he would write Common Sense. And he, these are not my words, his contemporaries called him the penman of the American Revolution. It was Paine who was the righteous rage of the American Revolution. Paine knew what it would take to move a people to revolution. It was James Madison that knew what it would take to move a revolution into a republic. And it was the combination of those two characters, the righteous rage of Paine, the pious logic of Madison, that created the unique aspects of the American democracy.
Right, and you talk about, those, you're primarily a Madisonian scholar, right? And so are you now kind of, Paine seems to be lifting up?
My children would beg to differ, since my house has 8 busts of James Madison and a full-life version of James Madison. For some reason, my wife thinks that 8 busts of James Madison is enough, which I can't imagine why. But, it's funny, because in the book I talk about, towards the end, how I try to sum up how I feel about Thomas Paine. And it's very hard, because Paine died with virtually no friends. He has the distinction of being charged with sedition in all 3 countries that he claimed citizenship. He was unpopular in all 3 countries by his death, which was barely attended at his burial. He was irascible. He was incredibly principled. He was impossible. He couldn't go into a pub without starting a fight. Benjamin Franklin's daughter said it would have been better if Thomas Paine had died after Common Sense. And what I note in the book is she was one of his friends. And the only way I could sum this up is I'm actually a film noir nut. And I'm one of those people that has to have something playing in the background for me to focus. And it's always film noir movies, which is another thing that drives my poor children crazy. They beg me, can we get something with color on TV? But there's one of the greatest, I think the single greatest line of a film noir movie that sums up my feelings about Thomas Paine. And it's with Robert Ryan and Joan Fontaine. And Fontaine is the greatest femme fatale ever to be on film. And in this movie, she has devoured every man in her life. She's this carnivore and betrayer of everyone who loved her. And in the final scene, Robert Ryan falls for it again, spends the night with her, and then in the morning realizes that she's lied again to him and that she's going to go back to her husband. And he goes to the door and she begs him to stop, and he turns and delivers this line. And he says, I love you so much, I only wish I liked you. And I think for Thomas Paine, I love him so much, I only wish I liked him, because he is, in my view, the quintessential American.
Well, when you say he was principled and not popular, it just makes me think about our politics today, which is performative and all about popularity and not very much about principles.
No, that is very true. I think that Thomas Paine was one of the most principled figures of the revolution. I would say he is the most. I can't exclude James Madison, or I'll burst into flames. But he was principled to a fault. It almost got him killed. And what I also like about Paine is that I follow Paine's life in the book, because he's only one of 2 central figures that played a role in both revolutions. And so the other being Lafayette, And so Paine went to the French Revolution, where he was received as a virtual god in Paris. He was made a member of the National Assembly, even though he couldn't speak French. But he soon, as he always did, irritated everyone around him because he was so principled. But to Paine's credit, he was opposed to many of what were called the precautionary devices of Madison, that Madison and the founders wanted to protect democracy from itself. They didn't want the Athenian democracy, which became what one called a mobocracy. And so they wanted to create a democracy that could funnel the pressures of a democratic system so it didn't devour itself. Madison believed in that this was essential, where Paine wanted more direct democracy with fewer safeties on it. That's what he got in the French Revolution. And it came damn near to killing him. He came within 24 hours of being guillotined. He was at the Luxembourg Palace. And the only reason he wasn't executed was a complete, just fluke. Because in the palace, they would write the number of people to be executed in a cell that night. And there were 4 in the cell. They wrote 4. It was him and 3 Belgians. But Paine was sick. So the Belgians asked if they could open the door. And when they did, it pushed the number on the inside so that when the jailers came to get the condemned, they walked right by the cell. That's the only reason Paine survived. And then soon thereafter, Robespierre was executed, and the terror ended.
Wow. Thin little turns of history there. So you mentioned the inconsistency. A lot of the founders were conflicted on slavery in particular, Jefferson notably, and others, Washington. So how much did that principle on slavery and the compromises on slavery affect the outcome and Paine's stature? Was he in any way outcast because he was not one of the slave owning guys?
Well, I don't think he was outcast to the extent that, for example, John Adams was anti-slavery. Mm-hmm. I think he was outcast because he was an outcast. I mean, he was not like any of the other founders or framers. He didn't have formal education. He was poor. He actually gave most of the money away. The Common Sense was the first world bestseller. And Paine gave most of that money to soldiers in the Revolution. He kept the price of all of his publications low because he wanted people to be able to read them. And so he was always broke. But he was also someone that did not suffer fools gladly. But there was a begrudging respect. When Common Sense came out, John Adams' wife wrote him, because it was anonymous, and said, people are saying you wrote that. And John Adams wrote back and said, I couldn't have written that. But he says, I think I know who did. I met a man, and his name was Thomas Paine, and he had genius in his eyes. And that was the most kind reference that Adams ever said about Paine.
You say the revolution was more about liberty than democracy. How so?
Well, of course, the Declaration of Independence does not refer to democracy once. It refers to liberty. And one of the things that the book talks about is that what makes the American Revolution unique is that it was really the first true Enlightenment revolution. The Enlightenment works had been published earlier, but this was the first revolution that was based on the Enlightenment. And it created a fascination in Europe. There was a wonderful writer by the name of Crèvecoeur, who was a Frenchman who wrote under the name Farmer John. And he wrote a very popular book about his time in the United States. And the thing about this book that I thought was most remarkable was just one line where he asks, what then is this American? And it really captured the time. People thought that we were like a new species. They couldn't understand us because we had nothing in common. We were coming from different places. We were coming to a new land. We didn't have history together. We didn't have clans or culture or class structures. We were all joined by this legacy of ideas that had never happened in history, not once. And they were fascinated. And when Crèvecoeur said, what then is this American? Europeans were fascinated by that question. They were fascinated by us. And what the framers, the founders did is that with the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration itself is a pure Enlightenment document. It talks about natural rights that were bestowed upon human beings by God, not a creation of the government. Now, that was a radical idea. And so the Declaration of Independence said that these are your rights given to you as human beings, that you cannot be truly human without the right of freedom of speech and association and all those other things. That's why the framers believed that this was about liberty. They did not want the Athenian democracy. Even though a lot of my colleagues have written wonderful books about the Athenian democracy, and I've really ticked them off.
What do you mean by Athenian democracy?
Well,
direct democracy? Or?
Yeah, that's pretty much. Athens is viewed as the sort of original font of democracy, but the Athenian democracy was an utter failure. It didn't last very long, and it resulted in tyranny. And in fact, that pattern, which I talk about in the book, because this book is really a book about revolutions, our revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. And, the book starts by quoting a Frenchman from the French Revolution who said that revolutions like Saturn devour their own. This is a reference to Saturn or Kronos in Greece that devoured his children because he believed that they were threats. But it really did capture what particularly Paine and others saw in the French Revolution. But historically, revolutions devour their own. The American founders wanted to break that cycle. They wanted to create a democratic-based republic that would not devour itself through the passions that it produced. And that's what was so unique. Because the first half of this book looks backwards, the second half looks forward. And the first half looks at the French and American Revolution and asks why these two revolutions occurred at the same time. And one became the oldest, most successful democratic system in history, and the other became the terror. And what was the difference between those two revolutions? What were the elements that got us to where we are now?
And when you say natural rights, you mean, I think it's in the Declaration from our Creator. I think you're also involved in environmental, do some work at the law school. And when I hear natural rights, I think of Laudato Si, the Pope's encyclical. I think of, humans evolving in nature, part of nature, the rights of nature, and part of an ecosystem rather than separate and above it. So did that interpretation of natural, did that come into play at all?
It did. One of the most interesting aspects of the early writings on natural rights are the influences from science. The hottest thing at that time for intellectuals was Newtonian physics. And when I was researching an earlier book, I went to Princeton, looked at some of Madison's writings, and you sort of have to hate him a bit because of the languages he spoke as a freshman. And he wrote his constellation of hundreds of planets just in his spare time, which you got to hate him for that. But it was all Newtonian physics. He was fascinated. And a lot of those Newtonian concepts echo in some of his writings, the Constitution, the idea of three branches as sort of heavenly bodies locked in an orbit. All of that sort of is Newtonian. But the framers, it was not just the idea of these are rights given to you by God, but also what intrigued them about Newton was that there was an idea that nature had certain inviolate rules that existed before we ever showed up.
Gravity was there, yeah.
Yeah, and so they believed that governance had the same rules, that there's certain rules to the universe that were not created by government. And it played very well into their Enlightenment ideas.
So they learned from nature and science. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote in his masterpiece, Democracy in America, quote, "I know of no country where there prevails in general less independence of mind and less true freedom of discussion than in America."
Yeah, I actually quote Tocqueville a lot in this book, and his writings are wonderful. And I do think that he got America. Even when he sort of did a slight backhand, He got us. Because he was intrigued by what he saw in the United States, and he generally liked what he saw in the United States. He believed this was part of the future of mankind. But he was also mystified. At one point he said, I don't understand. The United States constantly veers in different directions all the time and somehow gets from A to Z faster than any country on earth. And he was sort of fascinated by just the raw energy and the character of the American people. The second half of the book gets into the sort of American character. And it asks whether this republic can survive in the 21st century, can survive us. And that's by no means a given. It's a dangerous conceit that because we've lasted 250 years, that we can face anything. And the book talks about robotics and AI and some of the challenges coming down the road, which are going to be extraordinary. And I am less confident about some other systems. I just spoke in Prague not long ago and didn't make any friends because I was asked whether I felt that the EU could survive what's coming, and I honestly said no. I think the EU is going to fail in a spectacular fashion because it has destroyed the very elements I talk about in this book that we will need to survive the 21st century. But the greatest thing that we have is what Krev Kaur said of what then is this American? I mean, we have to be prepared to answer that question of who we were and who we are in order to survive what's coming. We have to understand what we need to be truly American. And part of that is, in my view, a liberty-enhancing economy where people will have economic freedom, not just political freedom.
Well, I want to get to that in terms of who we are before we define free speech. But I also like to focus on who you are. You wrote that members of the Bush administration should be prosecuted for torture and war crimes. You oppose the death penalty. And yet you also have criticized Tim Walz as being a supporter of censorship and blacklisting system. You're on Fox News. So right now, when we're sort of quickly identified into tribes, you're a little bit in this fuzzy middle area. So tell us who, your principles and doctrine as we're talking about Thomas Paine.
Well, I'm a Bears fan. And that is a tragedy that sort of captures much of my life.
If you're a Cubs fan too, then
I am a
double.
Cubs fan too.
That's
yes,
double.
Yes.
Then. I'm sorry.
And the terrible thing is I've raised all my children to be Bears and Cubs fans. I have a strange prenup agreement with my wife. It's unique. She agreed that I could raise the children Bears fans, and I had to agree that they would be raised FSU college football fans. And so we've met that, but. No, it is funny because people spend a lot of time trying to figure out where I am politically. I am certainly libertarian. I think that's without question. But I come from a very liberal democratic, politically active family in Chicago. I worked much of my life for Democratic politicians, Ted Kennedy, Sid Yates, William Proxmire. But I was always libertarian. I've worked for 4 networks, CBS, NBC, BBC, Fox. I've liked all of it. So I've been at this a long time on the legal analyst side and the columnist side. And a lot has changed with our politics and also with our media. I do try to get things right. I try to call them as straight as I can. I think it's a great privilege to be able to talk to people about current events, and I do try to get it right. I always joke in every network I have, I say in my next life I'm going to come back as a political analyst because you don't have to be right. But I do try to get it right. But
so would you say you haven't changed, but American politics and institutions have
that's
changed?
I think true. I mean, part of it, I've become much more isolated in higher education, but I think higher education has changed, and in a way that I never thought would be possible. I've been teaching for 30 years, and I've been a big critic of the change in higher education. I have some very liberal views, and typical libertarians were sort of a mix of different views. and I have some conservative views. But largely higher education now runs from the left to the far left. And it's a tragedy. I feel sorry for my students. You know, when I went to University of Chicago as an undergrad, it was like an awakening for me. I knew there were young Republicans, I just never met one. But to me, going to University of Chicago as an undergrad was like walking into the Star Wars bar scene. I mean, I lived at the Dorchester Cooperative where The Jungle was written. And it was a vegetarian cooperative. And downstairs we had Trotskyites that would meet weekly. Upstairs we had militant vegans, if you can imagine what those are. Next door we had libertarians. And I loved every minute of it. It's not that I agreed with them, but I was fascinated by people that could see things that I was seeing and see something completely different. My students simply don't have that today. It's just the range in higher education has become so narrow and intolerant, and I think that has changed.
Yeah, and we don't have those skills. We don't have those social muscles. I saw a commencement address at my alma mater, Occidental College, where the speaker said, "Be hard on ideas and easy on people."
Oh, that's a great statement.
I think what you're talking about is a time where you could be. There's more balance. That Star Wars scene in your life you're talking about. You could debate, but it wasn't personal. It wasn't. No. It wasn't. There wasn't the personal animus that there is now.
Well, you know, both these two books deal with rage, and it's not like this is our first age of rage. You know, this country was born in rage. Most countries are the progeny of revolution, and you have to reach the rage stage if you are going to engage in revolution. Oh, the Boston Tea Party was a moment of rage. And so we've gone through these ages of rage, and we're in one now. But rage is a very strange thing. It allows you to do things and say things you would not ordinarily do or say. And what people won't admit is that they like it, and that they need it, and it's addictive, and it's contagious. And I'm not talking about one side or the other. You see it all around you. People like it because it allows them to do things that they would not ordinarily do or say. And it's hard to come out of a rage period. We've come out of it before, but usually in these rage periods, the first target is free speech. And often a target is our democratic system. And that's one of the things I talk about in Rage in the Republic, that I talk about the sort of new Jacobins. You know, these are people today who are saying that the Constitution is a failure, including the dean of Berkeley Law School saying that the Constitution is a failure. I have a colleague who wants to amend the First Amendment because she says it's aggressively individualistic, which is certainly true. That's what it's supposed to be, is aggressively individualistic. And I sort of talk in Rage in the Republic about this crisis of faith that is dangerous, because we can survive the 21st century if we keep the elements that got us here. The only way we will not survive the 21st century is if we start to remove from the Constitution those precautions that Madison put in, the very things that did not exist in Paris. Then we are in serious trouble.
But you say we've had other periods of rage, but in this period, there's a rage industrial complex that is monetizing and fueling and encouraging and our rage. And so that powerful force, like it's one thing, humans can get angry and then have a beer together or calm down. But when there's this constant powerful force, that seems to be different than the previous eras of rage.
No, I think that's true. And look, I work for the media and we contribute to that. I've worked for liberal networks. I've worked for a conservative network. And we do have this sort of this echo-chambered media now. And that's true on both sides, liberal or conservative. That's not necessarily going to change. But what has changed is, I'm very critical in this book and in my prior book about what I call advocacy journalism, is that J schools or journalism schools are now teaching students that objectivity and neutrality are passé, that they are no longer considered the touchstones of journalism. That, I think, is why the public is moving away from mainstream media. And now most people are getting their media from social media and from alternative news. That's probably not going to change. But mainstream media is going to have to change. I spoke recently in Library of Congress to a media group. And I said, look, I've worked with most of you at these three networks, and we've become a ship of fools. The public is leaving us. And you don't even seem at all curious as to why. And the greatest example of this was Jeff Bezos brought in a new editor at the Washington Post who just recently resigned. And he came in and just delivered a truth bomb in the middle of the network, in the middle of the newsroom. And Lewis said, this is almost, I think it's almost a direct quote, said, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. No one is reading your stuff. You've lost $70 million so far this year, half of your readership. No one is reading your stuff." In other words, you're writing for each other, and that can't be sustained. So I think that what you're going to see is these particularly the media, is going to have to change if it's going to play a significant role. And I think it does need to be a significant part of our political system.
Right, we're in this age now with AI and misinformation. We know that false and sensational things spread more quickly, get spread around than truthful, nuanced, complex, contextualized information, right? Something that's short and sizzly. It may not be true, but it sounds good, versus textured nuance.
No, that's true. No, but I have to say, and if you read my last book, should be abundantly obvious, I am not a fan of censorship. I don't believe in the whole efforts of disinformation, misinformation, or my favorite, malinformation. Malinformation was identified by the agencies as true statements that are used for misleading purposes, which is a completely frightening concept for the government to use to silence people. I don't believe in censorship. I do believe that the greatest disinfectant is sunlight. I think that the solution to bad speech is good speech. About a year ago, a little more, I spoke in Berlin at the World Forum, which was probably the most anti-free speech conference I've ever been in. And we had some rather sharp exchanges with the EU. There were two of us that were from the free speech community, just two. And but one of the exchanges I had with a German EU member is I said, I'm so glad this is being held in Berlin, because you have one of the most longest standing censorship systems in Europe. You've been at this even before World War II, but certainly after World War II. How's it going for you? Right? I turn on the TV and there's tens of thousands of neo-Nazis marching in your street. You haven't even taken a dent out of that. But a recent poll showed that only 17% of Germans feel comfortable expressing their viewpoints in public. That's how it's going. You've silenced the wrong people. And the fact is, as I say in both books, in the history of the world, there's not one example of censorship ever working. Not once. It's a complete and utter failure.
How about accountability? I hear you on censorship, and the things that are most troubling or upsetting are those which need to be protected. Otherwise, there would be no debate about it, right? But how about accountability? And I'm thinking about tech companies that algorithmically elevate certain content because they know it's sensational and it will make them ka-ching. Yeah. And so this is a clause of the 1996 Communications Act, which means they have no accountability for doing that. So I can say free speech, but okay, how about publishers who knowingly boost things that...
That's a really good point, Greg. And I've actually talked about the algorithm issue with social media heads. And there is some validity to the complaint, but there's also some, I think, failure to understand the intricacies of this. That is, these are engines that are designed for people to be able to see content that they are interested in, right? So the algorithms will certainly direct you towards postings, towards sources that you are more likely to want. But also, there is a general herd aspect in terms of usership. And so what a lot of people object to is, well, why do these sites, why are those so popular and not this one, which is so substantive? A lot of that is the market for information. So I think the solution is to force greater transparency of the algorithms, to make sure that these algorithms, I have no problem with algorithms that are assisting people to see content that they want, because I'm a big believer in that. If you want to just listen to people with tinfoil on their heads and microchips in their molars, God bless you, fine. And these companies will help you find those people. But we do need greater transparency to make sure that these algorithms are not just favoring certain types of viewpoints.
You write about Columbia Law professor Tim Wu, who wrote a column in the New York Times titled "The First Amendment is Out of Control." Yeah. Among his critiques is that it largely serves corporate interests. And I see an example of that recently when Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg testified in a class action case that's going on now that you're probably following on how Instagram harms our children. And some years ago, Instagram created these filters that depict or promoted cosmetic surgery. Internal company studies found them to be harmful to young girls. They were taken down. But Zuckerberg lamented in court last week that some people thought that that was somehow a suppression of free speech.
Well, the Meta trial is a really interesting one. I'm a little bit skeptical. I teach torts, which is a product liability, and it's the basis of the Meta litigation. I still don't see how they're going to hold this together. I think there is a difference between social media and like tobacco, particularly because tobacco, you had an addictive element that you could measure, and you could see them suppressing information about and also enhancing the addictive element. The problem with social media is that it is infused a lot with free speech.
It's also addictive.
It is addictive, but the question is how we define that term legally. What's the difference between something's an obsession and what's something that's an addiction? And
But today with brain science, dopamine, we know, and this may be a case where law is lagging technology. Surely it's a
No,
case.
that might be true. I haven't seen I'm open to it, but I just, particularly as a free speech advocate, it worries me that I have no sympathy for Meta or Zuckerberg or any of these folks. But I am worried how you will thread this needle. I mean, if you're going to say that social media is addictive because it's fueling people's interest in certain types of messaging, that could have a huge chilling effect on, you could say that a lot of people as sources of information are harmful, and you can develop an addiction to. It's going to have to be something very concrete. I haven't seen that in the trial yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. Well, we're talking about the First Amendment. I don't know how many people could recite it. You probably can, but I want to take a minute to unpack it. Because when I looked at this, because I thought we all think we know it, and then okay. So Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it's Congress shall make no law. It doesn't talk about corporate policy. It mentions people. So when corporate policy, how can that be a First Amendment issue when the First Amendment speaks to Congress's power?
No, that's correct. The First Amendment deals with government regulation. And first of all, I just want to note that the most quintessentially American part of the Constitution was the First Amendment. The fact is, if you read our Constitution, much of that does come from the English system. The founders and the framers liked the English system. Many of them worked within the English system. They just didn't like what it did. So there's lots of influence of the English system, obviously. The most unique American voice is found in the First Amendment. That had no precursor when it came to free speech. The British never did protect free speech. They still don't, in my view. That was something very new that came out of the United States. But it does refer, as you say, Greg, to Congress. I will raise a pet peeve of mine on this. because many of the people I debate and fellow academics will say it's not a free speech issue because the First Amendment only deals with the government. And that was one of the big arguments, by the way, during the censorship peak during the Biden years, that as long as these companies were carrying out the censorship, even with the encouragement of the government, it was not really a free speech issue because the First Amendment doesn't cover them. First of all, as I've testified in Congress, that's not true. You can have a private actor who is effectively an agent of the government. So it's technically not true to say that just because a private company does something, it's not a violation of the First Amendment. But the more important issue is that the First Amendment does not define free speech values in the United States. The First Amendment was only to deal with the most concrete existing problem at the time, which was government censorship, requirements of permits to import things, of course, all of those things. But it was never supposed to be the exclusive definition of free speech. If you read the early writings that led to the foundation of this country, free speech is much broader than that because it's viewed as a human right. And and universities, by the way, use this same argument. They say, we're a private university, so it's not a free speech problem because it doesn't apply to us in the First Amendment. It is a false rationalization. If the Constitution didn't bar racial discrimination and your university wasn't hiring any black faculty members, does that mean you wouldn't be guilty of discrimination? Of course not. Because the sin you were committing through discrimination wasn't just defined by the Constitution. Free speech, if you believe it's a human right, as I do, if you believe it is a natural right, as I do, it goes beyond the First Amendment. So whether it's a university or a corporation that is denying free speech, it can still be a violation of that core right. Now, what becomes more complex is that corporations themselves have their own free speech protections. And that creates conflicts between the free speech rights of individuals, individual corporations, individual people, and we then have to resolve that. We have to balance that. But those are true free speech issues.
A recent Supreme Court case decided that a Colorado web design firm called 303 Creative could not be compelled to create wedding websites for same-sex couples, which were contrary to the owner's religious beliefs. You have said that 303 Creative is one of the most important free speech cases in the history of the court. So how does 303 Creative balance the rights to free speech and anti-discrimination protections, which you just mentioned?
Well, my God, you have like a dossier on me, and I find it's very uncomfortable. And if you bring up my dog Luna, I'm going to get very upset. No,
I do my homework.
You certainly do, Greg. 303 Creative, I do think, is one of the most important decisions the Supreme Court has handed down. The irony is that when 303 Creative was issued by the 10th Circuit, I had to speak to the 10th Circuit conference, and of all of the judges in the 10th Circuit, and I'm afraid I took leave of my senses, and I thanked them for 303 Creative because I said, you got it so absolutely wrong that finally the Supreme Court's going to have to deal with this problem. And for some reason that did not go over well, but I was very happy that the prediction turned out to be true. I've written about 30 years ago, I wrote a piece about the coming collision between free speech and free exercise and anti-discrimination laws, that they were all colliding at the same point. And I said that the problem is that the Supreme Court has created these silos, particularly on anti-discrimination laws over here, and then you've got free exercise cases and you've got free speech. And I said they cannot possibly coexist. At some point, you're going to have a collision of an anti-discrimination law and a religious practice. And the problem is that you've created these silos separately. So something's going to have to collapse. And what I argued back then was that this isn't a real religious issue for the purposes of constitutional analysis. That I argued that it's really a free speech issue. That my argument was basically that the reason the court was just floundering on this is it kept on trying to get these two silos of free exercise and anti-discrimination laws to somehow work together, and it was crazy. the clarity would come from free speech. And the reason is that, in my view, there was only one way to resolve this on things like the cake issue. That if you have a Jewish baker and some neo-Nazis come in and ask for a Mein Kampf cake, I would hope that the Jewish baker would say, get the hell out of my shop. I'm not going to make that cake. And if you'd gone to a black baker and said, can you do a KK celebration cake? I'm hoping he'll say, I think you came into the wrong freaking bakery. No. Now, the key here is that it's all free speech because you're asking him to create a cake that expresses something that they find whether religiously or politically unacceptable or socially unacceptable. And so I think that Masterpiece Cake Shop really, the court ended up punting on it. They could have actually resolved it. The baker there said he would sell cakes to anyone. It's just that he wouldn't create a cake that violates his religious views. In my view, there was never any alternative for the court, but where they ended up in 303 Creative, which is to recognize that people have free speech rights for creative expressions, right? It's not for something that's not creative. If you're making 100 cakes and they're all Mickey Mouse cakes, and you're refusing to sell to someone because of their race or their religion, obviously we're going to prosecute you for discrimination. But if it's really expressive acts, like creating a special cake or being a photographer, that I think that people have a right to say no.
In the run-up to the 2024 election, you took issue with statements from Liz Cheney and others that another Trump term posed a threat to democracy and future elections. Last week, Trump said that Republicans won't lose a race for 50 years if the party passes voter ID laws and ends mail-in ballots. Just this week, former Republican Representative Joe Walsh said Trump is, quote, everything our founders feared, end quote, and his former party is an authoritarian embracing cult. So, do you still stand, where are you on Trump as a threat to democracy and liberty that you hold so dear?
Well, I just had this debate with a Harvard professor not long ago. He's one of the people that says democracy is dying. And this has been a mantra since the 2020 election. And my position remains unchanged. Democracy is not dying in this country. It's a very useful political slogan. But it shows an incredible ignorance of our system. Our system is working. The court has ruled against Trump and in some cases ruled for him. It just ruled against him in a major tariffs case. That was not the first time they ruled against him. The system's working. What people don't seem to like when they say we want to pack the Supreme Court or trash the Constitution is the system is not producing what they want. But that's not a failure of democracy. This country is divided right down the middle. And when that happens, less gets done. And maybe that's a good thing because we can't agree. And we go through these periods where Congress gets into this fierce gridlock, and then people start to say, oh, the system isn't working. It is working. Look at the country. We're divided right down the middle. We don't agree. So the solution is not to change the system, to pack a court in order just to get what you want. That's the real problem with a republic. You have to persuade people. And until you do, we remain divided. But, when I had this debate with this Harvard professor, I said, what is your evidence that our democracy is dying? Because we have this democracy, whenever someone comes up to me when I speak and says, I love reading the Constitution, it's so beautiful, I always know they've never read the Constitution. Because the U.S. Constitution reads like the tax code. It was written by the ultimate wonk. It was written by James Madison. And if you want to read a beautiful Constitution, read one of the French Constitutions. Because they had a lot of practice. They failed so often. But the fact is, this is a Constitution that wasn't just written for times like ours. It was written in a time like ours. It was written for bad times, not good times. You know, I had a member of Congress once say, you know, Professor, I know you're going to tell us again about James Madison and what the framers think, but, you know, people today talk like they want to kill each other. I said, Congressman, back then they were actually trying to kill each other. That's what the Alien Sedition Acts were, okay? Don't pretend that your problems are unprecedented. Every generation and every age of rage has had the same mantra. It's the same voices. People say, we've never encountered problems like this, that the framers couldn't have imagined problems like this. That's why we have to change institutions. It's all a conceit. This democracy is the most successful in history, and it will continue to be successful if we can get through this crisis of faith. If we actually do remember, what then is this American? If we can answer that question, we'll be fine. The question is, are we still able to answer that question?
So you're saying that it's not at risk, that the institutions are holding, that, you know, January 6th, which was an attempt to undo the counting of the electoral college, you know, Trump asking find some votes, fake electors, those are all examples of bad things that were attempted that didn't change the outcome, right?
It didn't change the outcome.
But at what point would you say that, like, you know, there are people who are still trying to change outcomes and put their thumbs on the scale? And this is not unilaterally one side, but, you know, the redistricting battle that's going on right now, that's changing a norm. That's not law, but it's changing, you know, as a constitutional scholar, you know, you're talking at the legal level, but there's also the societal norms and institutional level that seems to be fraying in this country.
You know, I actually, looking over history, do not see this period as an existential threat to us. Maybe we are an existential threat to us, but we are doing quite well. In terms of a stress test, things like January 6th, which was a disgrace, people seem to forget. Congress came back on January 6th, and they picked our president. Yeah, it's not like that was a great moment, but the system worked.
And lots of people voted against validating.
That's right. And a lot of people don't believe that election was fair. That's part of our division, but it doesn't mean that our system is failing because we're failing each other, because we hate each other, because we're not talking to each other, because nobody seems willing to be convinced anymore by anything but what they watch in their siloed existence. Don't blame the constitutional system for that. But as long as we don't mess with that system, it will survive us. Not that we necessarily deserve it, but it will survive us.
We're going to go to audience questions in just a minute. I want to talk about the major questions doctrine that states that the president must point to clear authorization when claiming that Congress made an extraordinary delegation of power to the executive branch. Conservative justices used it to strike down Obama's efforts to curb carbon pollution and Biden efforts to forgive student debt. It was invoked recently in the tariffs case. And Justice Gorsuch, you didn't mention in your column about the tariffs case, but it was really interesting that Justice Gorsuch kind of scolded both camps, and in particular the conservative justices, for selectively applying the major questions doctrine.
Yeah, actually, first of all, I loved the tariffs decision, but I'm a legal geek. I loved all of them. I actually don't. I have little patience with people that attack members of the Supreme Court, left or right. I can't say that I'm friends with any of the justices. I've had the honor of speaking with all of them, but they all really do love this country and they're trying to do the right thing. People that disagree with them say that they are ideologues and robots. I don't think that's true. And if you look at the tariffs decision, you see, in my view, the Supreme Court at its best. You have 9 people trying to get it right. Now, they fractured, and down that road lies madness if you try to count who's with which opinion, except the only clear thing is 6 people did not see this power in the president's hands. But Gorsuch is particularly, I think, a fascinating justice. I testified at his confirmation hearing, and I told the Senate at that time, I said, you're wrong about this judge. He is not going to be robotic. He's going to take his principles wherever they lead him, and sometimes that'll take him to the left, sometimes it'll take him to the right. And he has proven that way. He and Barrett have actually proven they vote more with the left than the left votes with the right. But they have shown that independence.
That's interesting, this sort of horseshoe where the left and the right converge. Question from the audience. Speaking of libertarians, I recall Ron Paul being exceedingly popular at liberal universities like UC Berkeley for his anti-war, anti-monetary system stances. Do you foresee university student bodies returning to libertarian viewpoints? If so, how?
Boy, that's a great question, because I don't think that young people are as monolithic as many assume. You know, the Rage in the Republic it talks about the polls showing an increasing percentage of young people supporting socialism and even communism. In, for example, Great Britain, it's almost 50% favoring socialism, and over 50%, I think, supporting the nationalization of industries. And one thing I mentioned in the book is that these are young people that have no memory or experience with the collapse of socialist systems in the 20th century. And socialism has had a rather bad record. And you see with people like Mondami, he's pulling a lot of these lines right out of, for example, Mitterrand. We used to say the same thing about the warmth of collectivism. Mitterrand, when he came to power, he said socialism is going to give you so much leisure time. He actually appointed a minister of leisure. So that he could help the French people figure out what to do with all of their extra time. And of course, the French economy collapsed. But a lot of these young people have no memory or experience with those socialist systems. Also, there is some interesting aspects with younger people. We're seeing that there is, in fact, a stronger libertarian tendency. And I think that the younger people are more discerning than we think. I remember years ago, I blog. I get up usually about 5 o'clock and I blog, which is why I have so many typos on my blog. And I remember one time my boys were going to school and they said, "What are you blogging on this morning?" And I said, "Oh, it's this bizarre story, blah, 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 blah." And one of my sons said, "Well, is it true?" And I said, "Well, it's from the Washington Post." And Ben said, "Well, yeah, but is it true?" And I was thinking, when I was his age, I would never have asked that question. If someone like Walter Cronkite said something, it was true, because your trust in the media was so strong. These kids don't have that presumption. They're all sort of from Missouri. They're all sort of show-me staters. And that means that there's more competition with mainstream media, but it also means that they're sort of discerning, more discerning than we were about their sources.
You talked about some of the protections, I think it was Madison, put into the Constitution. This question from the audience is, what is your view of the Electoral College, which was sort of a protection layer put in?
The thing is, my view has changed a little bit, but I've always been a bit critical of the Electoral College, only because I don't think it has served the purpose of getting people to spend more time on small states. The opposite is true, that a Democratic candidate has no reason to go to certain states, and a Republican candidate doesn't have much reason to go to other states.
And these days with targeted advertising, you don't need to go to New Hampshire. Your ads go to New Hampshire.
That's right. But the book, Rage the Republic, I do say that we have to emphasize in the 21st century protections for minority viewpoints, including small states, that I think is going to be very important. That one of the things that I track as some of the greatest threats to the American Republic is the concentration of power. That's the reason I don't like the EU. It's the reason I think the EU is inherently unstable. I think it will collapse eventually, if history is any indication, and it could very well go badly for the world when it collapses. Because they have, the book talks about how all politics is local. It's true that if we want to protect rights, we have to protect these enclaves of minority interests, minority viewpoints. And federalism does that. Small states, big states, protecting those states. You want to allow these states to continue to be laboratories for alternative views, so that a strong central government can't just simply muscle all of the states. And that's the reason I've been critical of President Trump. I was critical of his predecessors on some issues of this kind. My students will tell you I haven't liked a president since James Madison. And so all presidents in my lifetime have exceeded their authority, and the Supreme Court has brought them back. But it's going to be very important for us to preserve some of these mechanisms. And so I now support the Electoral College because I think it may be necessary to just reinforce the protection, the voices of some of these states.
There's an effort to reform the Electoral College to apportion it based on popular votes, because it's what's unfair part of it is winner take all, right? You win California 51-49, you get all the votes.
That's right, and there's various approaches to that the states are playing with. We might see some variation.
Question from the audience: how do we deal with news articles written by Google and ChatGPT that will soon be a main way voters get news? We need to require transparency on how these articles are made so that there's public can understand the sourcing of it?
I do, and I actually talk about that in Rage in the Republic. I actually talk about ChatGPT because I talk about the combination of AI and robotics, which is going to produce the greatest loss of jobs in the history of the world. And we are going to have a very large population of unemployed and potentially unemployable people. I believe capitalism will come in and will adjust. But we have to be prepared for how we're going to deal with that, because we cannot have this republic and have a kept citizenry. We can't do that. We can't just have a large portion of our citizens living off a government dole. We have to create a liberty-enhancing economy, a way for people to be able to be economically independent. But ChatGPT, the AI systems are largely unregulated. I actually have, and I talk in the book, a pet peeve about ChatGPT. I don't actually use AI much. I certainly don't use ChatGPT because ChatGPT years ago defamed me. And I talk about this as an example of the danger of AI in some respects, because years ago, ChatGPT had what they call one of these hallucinations. And it said that Turley had sexually assaulted students as a Georgetown professor on a field trip to Alaska. And every part of that sentence was factually wrong. I've never taught at Georgetown. We don't take field trips with students. I've never gone to Alaska with students. And I've never been accused of sexual harassment or assault. And so when this became a big thing in the New York Times and the Washington Post really dug into this. And I think they were a little disappointed it wasn't true. And but they finally called up and almost reluctantly said, you know what, that's not true. And I said, yeah, I know. And they said, but here's the weird thing, is that we are used to hallucinations with AI, but in this case, this is the only case we know of that's sort of a pure hallucination. Because usually what intrigues us is that ChatGPT was hallucinating about you, but we could find no stories that were the basis of the hallucination. Usually you have this little piece here, and then it sees this little piece here, and it comes up with some bizarre combination. They said, there's no pieces. So you never did go to Alaska with students. You never taught at Georgetown. You were never accused of sexual harassment. So it's like it just made it literally up out of nothing. Well, the funny thing is, the New York Times, the Post, everyone runs stories on this. And the solution to ChatGPT was to ghost me. So even today, and I think some of my students said that they can find their way around this, but for the last 4 years, if you put in, who's Jonathan Turley, ChatGPT would say, I have no information on Jonathan Turley. And so it just wiped away my existence. And I wrote a piece saying, and I talk about this in the book, is that it's sort of chilling because there's no right of recognition. So you can't sue someone and say, why won't you recognize me, right? I mean, it's sort of a horrible thought. But it also indicates that either you accept that ChatGPT defamed you and just go through your life as a sexual assaulter of students, or if you object, you're literally wiped out. You're the professor who shall not be named. And that is an extraordinary amount of power.
Indeed, those things, boy, concentrating power in some really intense ways. Regarding tariffs, President Trump has said he can continue through other means. Can he constitutionally do that? How?
Yes. He can. When this case began, I said that I thought he would lose. And I said that again after oral argument, although I did think the administration did a good job. I thought that Solicitor General Sauer did a remarkably good job in front of the Supreme Court. But the problem was with IEPA, it just seemed to me more likely that you were going to lose some of the conservative justices who tend to be more textualist. It was actually sort of natural for some of those justices to write the way they did, like Roberts and Gorsuch. It might not have been quite as natural for the liberal justices who tend to not be so bound on the text when it comes to deference. But in any case, I thought that he was likely to lose. But IEPA was the temptation because it's very nimble and very easy to use IEPA. And so I can understand why they wanted to test this, but there's actually 4 other tariff powers that the president has. He's already used 2 of them. The 10% across the board is one of them. They're not as nimble, and they have some restrictions. So, for example, one of them is basically 180 days until Congress gets to look at it. Mm-hmm. Another requires the government essentially to investigate individual countries as to whether they are creating barriers to our trade. But all of these are pretty deferential. So my guess is that he would be able to continue a large part of these tariffs. He obviously likes tariffs a lot. And so I expect he's going to use all 4 of these. Congress can, at least on a couple of them, check that. I'm not too sure if the votes are there. The other thing that Congress is going to have to do is to figure out what it's going to do after the tariff decision. As Justice Kavanaugh said in his dissent, he was very miffed and said, we haven't said whether you have to give the money back or how to give it back.
That's going to be left up to other courts and we're not going there.
And down that path also lies madness. You got, it's because Kavanaugh is right about one thing. Who do you give the money back to? Because the Democratic politicians were saying, and this may be true, I don't know, we're saying, the consumers have had to pay higher prices. Well, if that's the case, you can't give the money back to the companies because they pass the cost on to consumers. So they would be essentially double dipping. You would allow them to take the money on the tariff internalization and then take money on the tariff refund. So that makes no sense. Governor Pritzker says, give me the money. I want $9 billion, thank you very much. That makes no sense. To say, I'm the public, you messed with consumers, so just give me the money. I actually think one of the more interesting things that Trump could do is something he suggested earlier, which is possibly write a check to American citizens. Give the money directly back to American citizens, but to combine it with a vote in Congress to make the tariffs prospective only. That is, Congress could come in and say, we're not going to return the money to tariffs. There was an open debate about the meaning of IEPA, so we're just going to treat this as going forward instead of this madness of trying to do this, or possibly allow for a rebate to go to citizens in the form of a check. All those are sort of options. The problem is that Congress is so divided, the expectation is that they won't do anything.
And as we wrap up, so many of these actions have been based on declarations of emergency, right? The emergency powers, we saw that during COVID, governors had emergency powers. Trump has declared a whole bunch of emergencies, some which don't really exist, like an energy emergency where the U.S. is producing more oil than ever before and surpassed Saudi Arabia as the largest oil producer. Courts don't decide what an emergency is. It's not our business. That's a political question. As we wrap up, how is that going to be sorted out?
Yeah, you'll notice in the tariff decision, Greg, that the court stayed away from that. And it was interesting because, ultimately they didn't have to because they just saw IEPA as not giving the express authority for
That's
the president.
the law of...
The law that the administration first tried to use. But interesting is that some of the tariffs were based on the fentanyl emergency. And my guess is that courts would agree that fentanyl is a national emergency because of the number of people who've died because of fentanyl. So I think would be treated by courts as an emergency. And you're right, courts tend to defer, but largely because the federal laws basically leave it up to the president. So these laws have always said that, and both Democratic and Republican presidents have used it in broad ways to declare emergencies. And so the laws are written in that way, and the courts will defer to them. And I don't think that's going to change.
Be interesting to see, what happens next. Our thanks to Jonathan Turley, author of Rage and the Republic, The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution, and the Ken and Jacqueline Broad Family Fund for supporting tonight's events. Please join us outside for books and reception. Thank you. And thank you
so much. Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much.